Today's guest on the Saltwater Edge Podcast is a distinguished marine scientist and avid angler. His scientific background has clearly directed his approach to his fishing. He has conducted fish research across both U.S. coasts, the Caribbean, and has amassed over 35 years in the field. He has authored or co-authored more than 100 peer-reviewed scientific publications. He has written 3 books, and he has contributed chapters to 4 others. His work often focuses on translating complex fish ecology concepts into accessible information for anglers, bridging the gap between science and practical application. His passion for fish and their habitats was ignited during his upbringing near the Chesapeake Bay, where he witnessed the decline of the bay's ecosystems and fisheries. That early exposure fueled his commitment to effective fish and habitat conservation, driving his professional endeavors and personal interests as an angler. Please welcome Dr. Aaron Adams, Director of Science and Conservation at Bonefish Tarpon Trust, to the Saltwater Edge Podcast. Hey, Aaron, how are we doing today?
Hey, Peter, it's good. A little chilly down here, but we'll suffer through.
Yeah, it's starting to improve. It was darn cold up here, but it's getting better. But I know it's still a Florida cold down there. What's that, 50 or 40 or how low does it?
Yeah, it was 53 when I woke up this morning, and I think it's getting up to 65 today.
Yeah.
So that's pretty tough for us.
Sure.
I mean,
yeah, my wife,
I have on jeans, socks, sweatshirt, drinking hot tea.
Yeah, Patagonia. Yeah, it's my wife's from Baltimore, and I hear it all the time when it's just gets a little windy and cold up here, especially Newport. We get the wind off the water, and It feels worse than it is. But she's not buying it. It's just bad.
Yes.
So, Aaron, I came to know you because I've read both of these books with great interest. The first, Fisherman's Coast, and the next one, Saltwater Prey. And I know there's a third book that you wrote, I think, with Orvis about the fishing. But what I thought was so interesting is that the 2 books work together. And I read them out of order, but reading the second one made me very interested in going to find this one called Fisherman's Coast. And, it seems like you flipped the script because typically you see an article, it's about the fish, and then the line or the lure you might use and where you might use it. You flipped it. You started with the habitat and the why and what lives there, and then what flies, in your case, or lures, if other anglers might be listening, you'd use or expect to find and expect to be effective. And so what got you, it's the science background that got you thinking that way from the get-go?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, my science informs my fishing, and my fishing informs my science.
Yeah.
But yeah, starting way back when I was, I don't know, I think I started fishing when I was 3 or 4 years old. And it wasn't long after that I started to ask questions about why, not just going to a place. I mean, that's kind of where I first was exposed to tides. Fishing on the eastern shore of Maryland with my folks, and going to this area on a creek and catching a lot of bluegill, and then going back a day or 2 later and it's dry.
Yeah.
Right. So there's no fish. And so, yeah, from way back then, just the kind of why started to be a major motivator for me. And
Sure.
So, I mean, it kind of becomes a thing, lack of a better term, of thinking like a fish. Right. And the fish they're not thinking per se, but they're reacting, incorporating all the things that they experience, in the framework of what their genetics has them set up to do. And so
that
I think a lot of
hearing sound through a lateral line, or better eyesight for this fish, or right, more powerful tail for that fish. Those are the genetic things you're talking about.
Right. Or the different colors they can see. Right. So some fish, like tarpon, they can see all the colors that we can see, our visible spectrum, but they can also see ultraviolet light and infrared. Right. So when for tarpon flies, not all of them, but some of them, sure, I put ultraviolet in those flies.
Yeah.
Other fish, like redfish, they can't see ultraviolet. So there's really no reason to do that. So understanding the fish's perspective, that was kind of the motivation. And then a second motivation was kind of through my career, realizing that I was pretty unique in that I read the scientific literature, the research, and also fished. there's a lot of people who do the research and don't fish, and there's a lot of people who fish and don't do the research.
Absolutely.
So yeah, kind of taking all the kind of dense and boring research stuff, getting the key parts out and putting it into the context of fishing. And that again goes back way to just me trying to explain to myself what was going on.
That always asking the why is what makes a good angler. I mean, honestly, you come in here, the Saltwater Edge, and you just want to rod and reel or something, but you don't have any why questions. Like, it seems like you're not likely to be successful anyway.
Right. So it's
correlation.
Yeah, but I mean, there's another way to look at it too. Is what I've been doing with these books for saltwater, people have been doing for trout fishing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
How hundreds of years, right? So when you go to let's say you go to a fly shop out in Montana, and you talk to them about flies, they're going to tell you what bugs are coming off, or what nymphs are active that time of year, what the water temperature is, right? So you're already taking the perspective of the fish from the outset.
Right.
For whatever reason, in saltwater fly fishing or saltwater fishing in general, those kinds of questions haven't really been addressed.
Right.
It's all about go here and use this lure.
And that framework's very helpful. I mean, I copied a quote out of, was just looking for it in one of the books, but it's your point is the importance of being scientifically literate in fishing, bringing some aspect of the understanding of the science to your fishing is going to be a plus to whatever effort and time and all the other things you put into it. And your perspective, like you described, the trout guys often think about the habitat or what's actually happening food wise. And I think you also made a point in one of the books that the saltwater fly guys kind of missed that bus. And this kind of work is helpful. And then there's some others that are books that are really almost like the Peterson Field Guides, where you can look up, individual bait fish, but it doesn't tie it out to the fishing, right? So it's an unbroken chain. The Saltwater Edge, we sell surf gear, fly, light tackle, and jigging. And I think the logic that you apply transcends all of those. I mean, it's what lives here, what's the bait here, and then you started to talk a little bit. I want to ask a follow-up question about the tarpon, because I do think of it that way in a couple popular game fish here, striped bass and false albacore. They feed differently. One with a powerful tail and an X-lateral line, the other guy more like a wolf pack in speed, but they have unique physical attributes that they apply to their survival, which I think, not very scientific way of saying it maybe, but might be, again, that genetic stuff you were talking about with their, is that my close probably.
Yeah. So albies or bonita or tunas, they're going to be in open water. They're going to be feeding mostly on stuff in the surface or top half of the water column. They're always moving because they mostly ram ventilate, is called.
Yep.
So if they have their mouths open and swim forward, the water's going through and they can oxygenate the blood. Fish like striped bass, they're pumping their gill plates to kind of pull the water through. And so you're going to have different behavior patterns. So you might have albies, they're moving so fast, by the time you see them, they're already gone.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you learn about how to fish for albies, if you can avoid the packs of boats running around, you kind of can watch them a lot of times for a bit, and you can see their pattern.
See a rhythm.
They might you'll be running a circle that's, a quarter mile around or something like that. And you can set yourself up for that. They might be coming up sometimes, but not often. And so they're kind of probably feeding on bait fish that are a bit deeper.
Mm-hmm.
Watching what the fish are doing, knowing what their kind of box of existence is.
Capability.
Narrows down a lot. Getting yourself in the right place with the right fly at the right time.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Now, the tarpon follow-up question was, so how do you know what tarpon can see?
Some colleagues did amazing research where they would get tarpon eyes. They would put electrodes on different parts of the eye and then stimulate the rods and the cones that can see detail and color. and then see what kind of nerve response they would get to different wavelengths of light.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
And because I mean,
So,
we're
yeah,
all kind of stuck trying
tarpon.
to figure out what fish think.
Well, I mean, it's kind of like the fish are the ultimate Zen
Yeah.
because they're not thinking, they're just being, right? So they're incorporating all the conditions around them, whether or not it's spawning season, different prey, different predators, all those things are just kind of being incorporated.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's how they're doing or why they're doing what they're doing at that particular time.
Right.
And so it's, yeah, I mean, tarpon, their vision is better than ours. They have better visual acuity and they can see more colors. They can kind of move their rods and cones around a bit so they can see well at night, well during the day.
Yeah.
You know, so it's
about tarpon fishing at night. Yes, I know.
yeah, yeah. I mean, tarpon been around 100 million years.
Yeah.
So they're doing something right.
Yeah, doing something right. Yes, that's true. That's true. And so I wanted to make note of the time. In fact, you spent some time at UMass Boston, and I think it was like 4 years. You said when we talking previously. So you got on the water up here some too. What did you have for experiences?
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, I was doing my PhD at UMass Boston. My research was back down on the Virgin Islands where I'd lived for 4 years prior. And I was working on coral reef fish for, as a job. But then, during free time, when stripers were around, I spent a lot of time on Cape Cod.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful spot.
And the way I fished Cape Cod was the same way I fished the flats in the tropics.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Basically wading as shallow as you think the fish will be. Is the big one. Back then, that was late 90s. A lot of people, if not most, were using intermediate lines. I only used floating. Again, you're just kind of trying to look at their diet types of things, but then also learning from some of the anglers, experienced anglers there to see what they were using, what they thought they were imitating. Right. And then trying to connect the dots between when and where they were fishing, the flies they were using, that type of thing. And then, making modifications from that. But learning just how the striped bass would use the tides and the flats the same way that bonefish and hermit do.
Right. I think there's a lot
catching catching some really big fish in less than knee-deep water for sure.
Right. Right.
Different times of year, different beaches. What's that?
They've done a good deal more study now on what they eat. UMass Boston was, in the Westport River, I think they did a lot of it, but it's not how specifically geographic it is, but just real preference for, and reading your stuff, I realized how a bonefish, for example, this is an example of I think of your being practical. Apparently the data says they eat a lot of clams. Well, what's the point in imitating clam, right?
Right.
But you also, and I think up there on the flats, there's tons and tons of sand eels. Back up in New England again, tons and tons of sand eels. Boy, but a crab makes a meal,
Yeah. So and that's going to change.
Effort. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, that's going to change seasonally too, right? So sand eels, once the water warms up a little bit, they'll push inshore for sure from offshore. But there'll also be different sizes of sand eels depending on the time of year. Sometimes the sand eels will be up in the water column. Other times they'll kind of burrow into the sand. So you also get the green crabs. You also get the more local tan crabs. You also get at times juvenile flounder on the flats.
Yes. Right.
And then of course, you get the big old American eels that striped bass just absolutely love.
Right.
There's other times you'll get worm hatches. Especially in the spring. You probably know about some of those.
Yeah.
So it's not just what they eat, but it's a combination of what, when, and where. And they're going to fish are going to be opportunistic to some extent. And the less fish they are, the more opportunistic I think they are.
The less competition there are, the more opportunistic? What does that mean?
No, the less fished they are.
Oh, less pressure.
There's a lot of fishing pressure on them. I think the fish tend to be not as opportunistic; they're more cautious.
Sure.
Um, but yeah, so on any given day, you might have. I mean, we talk about stripers. I remember fishing on Monomoy way back when, and stripers were coming up super shallow. And we thought they were going for sand eels, couldn't get any eats. Tried crabs, no eats. So we went back to sand eel patterns, kind of a extended, kind of almost like a sand eel version of a half and half.
Okay.
And and the fish would only take it on the drop. So my guess is that the sand eels were kind of at the water surface coming in with the tide. And if they saw a striped bass or another predator, they dove down to the bottom.
Tide. Sure.
And so for whatever reason on that day, the stripers were using that particular kind of pattern recognition.
Yep.
And you'll see the same thing with other fish. Taking a tarpon, bonefish, permit. Some days a certain fly works really well, and next day everything's exactly the same and not at all.
So pattern recognition, following up on that, that is in some way a trigger, but also, and correct me, but I'm believing that would be you'd see that sand eel example on the dip as a trigger, right? But it's also some aspect of presentation at the same time.
Oh, presentation is huge because you have to, as I told a friend, as we were fishing floating crab patterns for tarpon, and on a dropping tide, and he was casting it out and he was stripping it in. I guess because he was so excited, and I couldn't get to him. So finally, I said, "Okay, look, I just need you to be the crab. You're a crab floating out in this inlet. What would you be doing to not be seen?" And he said, "Just floating, not doing anything." Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not just the fly you use; it's how you're presenting it to imitate what you're trying to imitate.
Sure.
So it's different than just going, and you can catch fish this way. Blind casting clousers. I've caught many stripers that way.
Yep.
But you're going to be more successful in those tougher situations, sight fishing situations, if you're kind of more in that mindset.
I have a good friend who calls it hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
Because that's basically what, whether it's a boulder field, any of these habitats that you discuss, there's different methods that, the prey uses to avoid detection, whether, and reading up as I have for my bonefish trip, there's the walking crab versus the swimming crab, and that's a different kind of presentation. And, one just gets still and tries to just like hide in plain sight, it seems. Right. And you're right. Why would a crab on an outflow, like you were just describing, be making any progress across the current? It's just going to get swept out with it. And, because I think there's lots to learn from the fly fishermen, from the lure guys, and the opposite, because if there's observation going on, about how fish move through a habitat, boulder field, for example. And I know, as I was preparing for this, I know towards the back you have estuaries, salt marshes, which we have up here, beaches, obviously we have up here, and then some aspect of flats. We don't have the mangroves, we don't have the big seagrass beds so much, but but a lot of the rest of it we do. And so I found this book very, very helpful describing the habitats and how fish interact with them. It was interesting to read that salt marshes, which we think of, and you would know from your Boston experience, your Cape experience, there's all these things kind of change as you go from the tropics north, right? In mangroves, you don't see anything up here like that. But we have our Spartina, which holds our muddy backwaters together, our back bays. That's the called cordgrass too. But and you start to see that down through New Jersey, maybe further south than that. So this stuff transitions by temperature or salinity, or
it's all temperature
too. You said it's kind of dynamic, right? It's
all temperature. So it used to be 20, 30 years ago that the northern line on the East Coast for mangroves was Cape Canaveral in Florida.
Ah.
And that was the transition to salt marsh.
From mangrove to salt marsh.
Yeah. Now you get mangroves, I mean, extensive mangroves all the way up through St. Augustine, which is way north.
Yeah.
And then they're getting more and more kind of recruits of mangroves even farther north. And that's all due to climate change.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not only the general temperature, it's the minimum temperature that the species can tolerate. So if we were to get a super cold front where it got down into the 30s or 20s here, that would cause a mangrove dieback. Okay. But in areas where mangroves and marsh, salt marsh coexist, in my experience, the mangroves will take over.
It's kind of sort of a testament to how those things operate. I know, whether it's Florida or wherever I've been, you see one shoot in the middle of a pretty big open area, and that's just the start, right? Yeah. And it gets drifted there, and somehow is enough to produce that one shoot that's waving. And then I don't go back to these same places enough to observe, but that's how it starts, right? Literally with and it serves the same purpose. Well, you're the scientist, I'm a generalist, but it's the idea that the mangroves create some stability where silt falls out and things move around a little bit less, a lot like the sod banks do, right? They hold those environments together. Is that fair?
Yeah, they serve the same ecological function.
Yeah,
they're just adapted to different climates.
And probably more waves up north and more lower tide. I'm thinking Bahamas now. I mean, is that not?
Well, neither salt marsh nor mangroves can take too much direct wave action.
Yeah.
They can certainly take some.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like you'll see, most of the marshes up there are going to be in areas protected from direct, ocean waves.
No, true.
Mangroves can tolerate a bit more on the wave action, but basically they both kind of trap sediment coming off land. They can accumulate sediment, so they help to create wetlands. They can both handle tidal areas, so it can be totally exposed and then totally submerged, depending on the tide. And so with that function, they basically help to create that wetland habitat with creeks and ponds and all that type of stuff. And so, if you spend enough time in a marsh or a mangrove wetland, you'll see patterns where you'll see, okay, the plants have grown this way, and so it's caused the channel to curve this way, and so over here there's going to be a deep hole.
Yeah,
Aaron, those types of things.
My next question was, what are some ecologic themes that are similar in all habitats? You just jumped ahead of me because that's exactly it, right? There's a
right. So, and that's the thing about the book is, it was focused on the Southeast, Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean, but all of that stuff applies in New England.
Yeah.
All the way up through New England. So it's like, okay, for example, go back to striped bass.
Sure.
And on the sand flats of Monomoy, crabs or sand eel patterns, whatever the case may be. Let's say you go up somewhere in the Pleasant Bay where there's some salt marshes. You're going to have some crabs, maybe some sand eels, in the channels, but up in the shallows of flats next to the salt marsh and the creeks, it's mostly going to be mud minnows. Various species of small
fish.
Yeah. And so that's a completely different fly. It's a completely different approach. You take that and you come back down to the tropics, and in the mangroves, there's also different species, but a lot of mud minnows. So one of my favorite flies for casting for snook and redfish along the mangroves is a mud minnow imitation.
Yeah.
Because that's one of the dominant prey items there. And the same thing up there.
Sort of like a sculpin, one of those low. We know our mummy chogs up here. That's a goby or a something like that down there.
No. We have different species, but essentially mummy chogs here too.
Okay.
Just a bunch more species than you guys have up there, but it's the same. It's the same process.
Yeah.
So those habitats are serving the same function, and so again, you can take that type of stuff. And I did this, caught some really nice fish in the marshes in Pleasant Bay by using the approach that I'd used down here, the types of flies and that type of thing.
And like I said, I think it's and all these people approach it differently, but to me, I really do appreciate being able to go do a little bit of a deep dive. So at least when I see something, I notice those correlations, mangroves to our marsh grass up here, but also being a little bit more aware of, given this. So for example, like I do a lot of talks on reading the water. And one of the things I point out to people is that, up here anyway, sand is a pretty transient place because there isn't much to hold gamefish, a striper. I think of New Jersey, it moves. When they have bait, it's on. But if they don't have bait, the fish are on the move looking for it. Whereas a boulder field is a 24/7, 365 buffet, from the cunners and the lobsters and the eels. And I mean, you would know way more than me about what's living there, but an awful lot of things are living there. And so just the idea, so that's one of the things I think advantages Newport has, and where we hold our striped bass through the summer, because we all have that so much hard structure here, and deep water too. I mean, at one point, 110 feet offshore, it's 180 feet deep. That's Castle Hill right here in town, but otherwise it's that hard structure that helps hold fish through more of the season, because they've got food readily available.
Yeah, for sure. But even in those places, the behavior of the stuff they're eating is going to change based on the tide and time of day.
Yep.
So there'll be time, if you fish it, there'll be times where those areas are going to be more productive than others, where certain flies are going to work better than others. It's because of those types of interactions, for sure. Yeah. And even fishing beaches, like an active beach, like say the Atlantic coast of Cape Cod, Nauset Beach, or even down in Florida, some of those beaches, you'll get a good amount of structure. So you get a sandbar that's parallel to shore, but you'll also often get sandbars that are perpendicular to shore.
Yeah.
Where you'll get rips.
Those happen. The shore ones.
Right. Yeah. And then you also get rips that'll break through that outer sandbar.
Yeah.
And those are kind of junction points, just like, the mouth of a creek type of thing, that striped bass and bluefish will hang out on. It's just finding the right one at the right time.
Right. And I think part of the talk that I do, and I think a good sort of general tip for folks, is the white water tells you about the bottom. So in other words, where the waves break tells you that the bottom is raised enough to cause the wave to tumble and create white water. And then you'll see that cut you just talked about will be a clear gap between two sets of white water that are parallel. It's all very interesting. And it seems like you just took it further than I did in terms of curiosity to make 35 years out of it. But it's really, but it's a treat must be to be able to travel, throw your eyes on something for the first time, and have a place to start. It's going to turn into a question that I didn't write down. How would you, let's just be in Aaron's head. Okay. And if you want to walk out anywhere, whether it's the Caribbean, Florida Beach, or whatever you remember from UMass Boston, but what is it? How are you taking, can you give us a little bit of that thought process, that inventory, and as it relates to is it hard? Is it soft? Is it, whatever? I don't want to lead the witness. If it's not a 2-hour journey, I'd love to go a little bit of the way with you.
Yeah, we can get started anyway. So I guess typically number one is tide. What's the tide doing, and what's the tidal range? Right. So here, the range from low to high.
Got it.
So here in Florida, 3 feet, up there 6 to 8.
Yep.
And so that's going to influence the types of locations that I would want to fish. Because if you're, let's say you're way out on Brewster Flats on a low tide, the tide starts coming in, you better start moving.
Yeah.
Right. So you get a couple of those troughs between you and shore, and they're going to get overhead pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're fishing the flats, let's say in the Bahamas, a couple foot tide range, it might get too deep. The fish go somewhere else, way up in the mangroves, but you're not going to have any of those kind of issues.
Right.
So number one is tide.
Yeah.
For sure. I like exploring a new place, kind of focusing around in low tide because I can see more of what the bottom looks like. I also find that in a lot of cases, the bigger fish will stay shallowest the longest. And then they'll also be the first ones to push in as the tide turns.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's true for a number of species for sure.
Sure.
So yeah, number one is tide. The number two is the type of habitat. Whether it's wadeable, you need a boat to get to it, or stand up paddleboard or something like that.
Yeah.
And then it's this kind of habitat. We're probably going to see this type of prey, and then kind of select some starting flies from there.
Sure.
And then weather, so wind direction, whether it's approaching cold front, so the pressure is dropping, or pressure's rising after. All those are going to influence fish behavior and where they're going to hang out.
So let's do that. Let's do that pressure, because I think prey is what people would learn from resources like this. And up here, I think of it as estuaries, sand beaches, boulder fields, flats. And there's other things on, like we could call boulder fields. We have lots of cliffs here in Newport, but those are the pretty, you had a longer list in your book of like seagrass and mangroves, and also you're covering a bigger piece of geography. So, but how does that things like the weather factors you mentioned, wind direction and barometric pressure, how does that, because I feel like that's something I don't put as much thought into as I could. And if there's a couple takeaways, I'd love to know what they are.
Yeah, okay, let's start with, let's say, wind direction. So a strong onshore wind can delay or even reduce an outgoing tide. Right. So let's say you're expecting a 6-foot tide drop and you have honking east winds up there. That's going to keep a lot of water in the bays. And so you're never going to get that big tide drop that you might expect without the wind. Sure. And then the opposite works. If it's a strong offshore tide, then you might not get the high tide, or it might be delayed.
Right.
And so instead of coming in over, 6 hours, it might come in and not come in at all for a couple hours, and all of a sudden in 4 hours, the whole thing.
It can be that impactful. Wow.
Oh yeah.
I do know. I must have looked at I remember at least one spot where I think I told myself I must have looked at the wrong week. It was so, but the tide didn't come in. At the end of the day, it sorted out to be what it said it would be. But it was so, when I got where I was, I'm like, God damn, there's no water. How
right.
Didn't realize it could have hours of impact. It's really
something. Oh yeah. And with a place like, farther north than here where you have large tidal range, the tide kind of resets itself relatively quickly once the wind stops. You go to a place like the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean, where there's kind of a very minor difference between high and low tide. It can be, a day or more, a couple of days, for that to reset. Then go into like high pressure, low pressure.
Sure, thank you.
So in the Caribbean, where there's not much tide range, maybe a foot in most places, you can have a strong low pressure kind of sitting over an area, and that will depress the tide enough so that you never get a high tide. So it's almost like
the pressure, the weight.
Oh yeah, the extra weight from the pressure. Yeah, it actually decreases the sea level in that area. And so your range between high and low tide is actually kind of like, let's say a few inches or more lower than it normally is.
Yeah. And so example I've read about and I've experienced a little bit is maybe bonefish coming on a flat might be less likely to do that, in the sense that there's not going to be the water that there would typically be. They have whatever senses of all this, and the fishing isn't what you would hope, even though you're in the right place at the right time, tide chart wise. This high pressure, low pressure thing's impacted. Yeah.
Yeah. Another aspect is that colleagues who study fish physiology, they can't figure out how fish do it, but just based on experience, fish can feel low pressure approaching. And they often put on the feed bag when they have a low pressure system approaching.
Yeah, that's certainly something I've experienced. And you're saying they can't figure out. It's documented, but they don't have a here's what happens.
Yeah, there's enough personal experience, not just mine, but a lot of people. They just haven't figured out how, right? But at one point, they didn't know that sharks could detect a couple molecules of blood, in the water. They knew they could sense it, but not to that extent.
Yeah.
So we're just not sure what the mechanism is, but they certainly can. So if I see, for example, going back to your original question about figuring out a new place, if I see that there's a low pressure coming, then I'm going to go to places where I think the fish might be to put the feed bag on. So like a creek mouth at a dropping tide, places that they're going to really be able to feed pretty intensively while that low pressure approaches, because when that low pressure's through and the tide and the pressure starts to rise, the bite goes off. And I don't know why, but that's kind of universal. If you get just a rising pressure, the fishing tends to not be as good.
Sure. And I guess there's all could be theories, but I mean the idea that maybe it's how much water. I think it's striped bass are aware of how much water is above their head. You know what I mean? Yeah. In a flat situation like a Florida or a redfish thing, there might not literally be enough to scrape your belly on water, right? If it's just not enough water's come in for them to navigate. Yeah. Okay, but that's very interesting because there's part of that reading the water. I think of it as there's knowns and unknowns. Knowns are tide, moon, things like that. Unknowns are that high pressure you just spoke of, wind direction. Those are game time decisions that you have to have a methodology to factor them in, because that spot won't be what it was the last time you're in that spot on that tide. And it's funny. Let me ask you this, because I get two different answers here. Do you keep a fishing log?
No, I should. I did when I was a teenager, but no, I don't.
It's interesting.
Too lazy. Yeah.
Tell me why. Too lazy, you say?
Yeah, just too lazy, I think, at the end of the day. But it all kind of goes into the onboard computer.
Sure.
I mean, if you fish enough, it becomes just innate, right?
Sure.
And some people who are like super fishy, they just develop that sense of where to be at what time. For me, it's making all those connections, and then having that kind of sit, rather than kind of going back through logs.
Sure.
But part of it, part of that challenge too is, with all that information, there are times you can kind of overthink it.
Totally. Yeah. And so I have there's two schools, and a lot of people are in yours. They did, and they wish they continued. There's others that have done it in pen and pencil, but what good is it now? And then then there's all these apps and stuff. There's a particularly good one called Got One, which I think I'll share with you when this is over. But the idea of other attitude would be, why would I want to be burdened by the past? In other words, you bring an open mind to a more curious mind to a fishing situation. If you haven't, at least that some people have that attitude. I don't. I keep a log, and I try to. I'd like to think a little bit harder about some of those weather factors, like the knowns. I'd like to be better at adapting to the unknowns than I seem to be. You know what I mean? But there's some people, damn, they're always on it. They change gears, they put that in that onboard computer, and off they go. And it's directly related in my mind to time on the water. But I think a great cheat code would be to have studied it like you have.
Studied it and a lot of time on the water too.
Sure.
Yeah, because I mean you can study it all you want, but having that on water experiences, is essential as well. So it kind of comes, like I said, innate. It also becomes kind of. I thought about starting a logbook again, but to me, that kind of takes away some of the, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, almost immersion in it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'll notice if we've had bad weather for a while or I've been traveling or something, so I'm not in tune with the local tides and weather. It takes me a few days.
Yeah.
But you get back into that pattern and then you kind of start to automatically um, think that way based on tides, wind, temperature,
Sure.
time of the sunrise, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it just, again, kind of becomes part of life.
Sure. The it's the I would say that being away or traveling or having a lot of work that keeps you from doing maybe what you'd love to be doing, it does take some time to come back up to speed. But again, like I say, I think the larger library of experience you have probably shortens that time. Changing, not so much changing gears here, but there's one of the questions I wanted to ask you out of Fisherman's Coast. You said we can generally discuss the lifestyles of marine game fish and prey. And can you hit the highlights out of that? I know it's a chapter from 2000. When did you write this? 2008 or something?
That was 2004.
Okay. I can coach you a little bit, but it's chapter 1.
Yeah, because I have no memory of that's like 20 years ago.
But it was the idea that they pass through larval, juvenile, adult. I thought you might hit that as it relates to the game fish, and then prey in this broadcast spawning idea. I'd like people to hear about that because broadcast spawning is like what striped bass do too, for that matter. As I understand. So
Yeah.
complicate things. You talked about the generally similar lifestyles of most marine game fish.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good one. Most marine, well, so people a lot of times they think of fish spawning. They think of, largemouth bass with a nest or salmon with a red. And in that sense, the eggs are fertilized right there in the nest and the fry come out. And for a bass, the parent might protect them for a little bit. And then eventually, they kind of grow into where the adults are. For most marine fish, it doesn't work that way at all. So we'll use bonefish as an example.
Okay.
We think of them, okay, they're on the flats. That's great. That's where we fish for them. But they'll undertake long distance migrations. We've tracked them going close to 100 miles. And they'll go to like protected bays adjacent to deep water. They'll get together in groups of 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 fish. And then they go offshore at dusk and they spawn at night. We've tracked them going down to 400 and some feet.
Geez, you'd think there'd be predators for days down there.
Yeah, you'd think. But yeah, they go out. Sharks, billfish. And they'll go out. Yeah, they'll be in water that's thousands of feet deep.
That's the tongue of the ocean kind of act.
Yeah. Yeah. And then after that, they eject the eggs and sperm into the open water. Fertilization of the eggs is there. Then they go home. The adults go home. The eggs hatch in about 24 hours, and then the tiny larvae that doesn't look anything like a bonefish, when that hatches, it floats around in the ocean for between 40 and 70 days. And so it can swim a little bit, the larvae, to kind of go up and down the water column, but largely it goes where the currents take it. And so it could circle back to the same areas where its parents came from, or it could end up hundreds or thousands of miles away.
Yeah, wow.
Tarpon do the same thing. They spawn offshore as well. Permits spawn on like reef promontories or drop-offs or artificial reefs. Redfish typically spawn in coastal waters outside of inlets. So yeah, it varies on the species.
But that spawning you described of the bonefish in that example, is that what broadcast spawning is? Eggs and then sperm and then process happens and
right.
Generally,
it's all out in the open water, so it's called like broadcasting everything into the open water. Yeah, like groupers do it. I'd say most marine fish are broadcast spawners rather than nest layers.
So knowing when and where and all that, I know the Bonefish Tarpon Trust has been on this, but we're also I'm involved with the American Saltwater Guide Association. We've been doing some work on uh, false albacore. You would call them bonito down there, but same deal. I mean,
Yeah.
established. We had one. We might not remember Buzzards Bay. It's the bridge when you would go over to get to the Cape, right? A long time ago, but it's still there. And we tagged one there that then showed up off of Key West
Sure.
some number of months, 3 months later. And you know they
Sure.
don't swim straight. So, Jesus, what
Sure.
a job, right?
Yeah.
But it demonstrated coast-wide population, not like there's a northern version, there's a southern version that they're making that transit. You know, we're only learning more. We've placed 300 tags so far, I think, and then plenty of those spaghetti. Those are the catch, stick in the battery
Yep.
catch thing
Yep.
versus a tag in the back.
Right.
But very lots to learn, and you got a species you don't know much about. Probably not as valuable as any of the three you're watching, but the process of understanding the life cycle, the spawning, migration, and how to maybe protect the fish during the spawn. So you at least maximize the success, because those have big financial impacts. A lot of money you must have the number. I wanted to ask, what is the economic impact of maybe bonefish and tarpon and permit to like Florida, something like that, some number. I'd just be curious to tie it out to some, because it's massive.
Yeah. So these data are, wow, probably 12 years old. We're going to repeat the study this year, but the Florida Keys Flats fishery annual economic impact is like $465 million. The Bahamas, the bonefish fishery is about 169 million.
Yeah. But that's a lot of money for a place that doesn't have much money.
Yeah, and that's especially on the islands away from Nassau and Freeport.
Right,
so you go to like Andros, and it's a significant portion of the island's GDP. So yeah, it's huge, but it's also not just financially, but it's big culturally.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're in the Bahamas, a lot of the times the guides will be the fathers of other guides or the sons of other guides, right? So it's cultural in that sense as well. It allows people to maintain their coastal, ocean-oriented lifestyle.
Yeah, where their home.
A lot of the guides in off season, they'll build commercial fishing for lobster or grouper, that type of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, the same is true in Belize, Cuba, elsewhere. So it's cultural as well as economic. But kind of going back to talk about the spawning and the tagging and the protections. Another thing I've learned over the years is that anglers who are better educated on all the things we're talking about, so that they understand the systems that they're part of as fishermen, they tend to make better conservationists.
Yeah.
Right? Because they understand the connections.
Yeah.
So that's, in later years, that's become a big motivating factor as well. Because yes, there's fisheries management agencies and natural resource management agencies, but nobody's going to look out for these fisheries unless the fishing community does it. The fishing community is not going to do it, until they understand it.
Sure. Another kind of question I was curious, because I know you had to make in the prey book, you had to make some assumptions, because they didn't exactly study a bait you were interested in the habitat of the bonefish, because whatever access or deeper water. You made some good explanations as to how there's some interpretation in there. And I thought, because I'm always kind of, when I'm reading, whether it's those field guides, those Peterson field guides, or a book like yours, you're trying to create some connections, but you don't want to like overstep or overthink. It's kind of hard to figure out where the science ends and the intuition and the instincts, hunting instincts, like take over. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because you're so immersed in the science side, I can tell you are balancing by some of the comments you made in the books, but just this conversation, it's not science will take you to the fish or pure intuition will get it done. There's some mixing thing, but the literacy seems to be an advantage. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what is important, but how you apply it is even more important. So that interaction and the line between the science and the fishing, for me, I mean, that's kind of the secret sauce.
Yeah.
Um, and in the books or previously the magazine articles and whatnot, I tried to share that. And it's interesting because I've had comments from people who are relatively new to fly fishing, all the way to those who've been guides for 30 years.
Yeah.
And the amount that you get out of the books is dependent in some portion by how much experience you have. So it's kind of like you can understand more and ask more in-depth questions if you have a greater understanding of the topic. So
Yeah.
when you're new and you read one of the articles or the books, everything is new to you. And so you'll pick up some stuff, but a lot of stuff will just kind of, fly over your head or just be too much. Yeah. Whereas if you're experienced and you read through that, it might explain some things that you've observed.
Yeah.
It might say, oh, I went here, but maybe those guys are moving up there, right? So you can start to connect more dots. And so I think that line between the science and the fishing, that changes depending on the experience on both sides of that.
Sure. You make me think of the days you fish with the guide, how much they have experienced and what they're actually doing with their time. I think of a good friend of mine up here. He's literally retying a knot, glancing at the electronics and looking at the birds. It's like all right. And I'd have my hands full tying the knot.
Right.
Right. And so I think and you get to a place like the Keys or something, and the guide picks out this fly or this lure for you, and you have confidence in him. So right. Like, let's go. And it's
you're not paying the guide for a ride on the water. You're paying the guide for the experience.
Yep.
That you're going to get you to the fish. And that experience takes a while.
You'll get some takeaways from that experience with him.
Yeah.
I very feel very strongly about that. And then, like, to me, that's what led me to your book. Honestly, this Prey book was, I've got a bonefish trip coming up, and I've made a couple over my 65 years. And I am almost from that trout background you're talking about. I want to understand better what's where. And from this book, I certainly got a better understanding for all those crab patterns you see and the different colors. You can certainly start with the two types, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is where I am on my journey. there's two, there's the swimming crab and the walking crab, the mud crab that we have up here, or similar. But I mean, one's more of a, you see on the sand, and it swims and it gets away, and it's more active. And the other walks and stops and tries to hide in plain sight, right? Yeah. Well, that's going to change your retrieve, and might even change the. And then I always kind of follow a general rule, reasonably match in the background at the bottom, but not too exactly, because standing out a little bit is how they're going to maybe.
Right.
So it's very interesting. Like a resource like this is like there for you in different parts of your journey, and so that's really helpful. Really helpful.
And it's interesting too, because I think a lot of patterns that people throw for bonefish that they think of as, say, shrimp patterns. I think a lot of times that it looks a lot more like a goby or a blenny, small fish.
Yeah, I remember I might even read it this morning in preparation. The stripes, yes, are the thing that you see as common, and then we can spend a long time whether we're talking about flies or lures or whatever, impressionistic versus realistic, and there's three great surfcasters. When I talk to surf casting clubs who they're interested in fly fishing, I'll tell them that these three great surfcasters. Steve McKenna, he's the guy who developed the way to rig a sluggo as an eel. Crazy Alberto's down with you now in Florida, developed tackle anglers clips and a couple of other pretty common surf casting lures and stuff. And then Tony Stetsko, who was on the Outer Cape when you were, legendary surf guy, have all said to me at one time or another, if the bait's small, if they get a long look, if they're feeding in flow, I want a fly rod because it's a better tool to fish those environments than a lure that you have to put action on by turning the handle, right? You can dead drift a lure a bit, but there's and so it's it was pretty interesting how they broke it down. It was interesting to hear what they really saw as the advantages of a fly rod. And then if you're sight fishing, well, they're going to get a long look, and so that looking like something that is suggestive, probably covers more bases. Odds game, and you said they feed opportunistically. So I think a striped bass and those. I just don't know what that percentage is. I don't suppose you have the magic number, right?
I don't. But yeah, so like if I'm coming up with a fly or selecting a fly, the first thing I think about is motion.
Mm-hmm.
So, when a fish makes a motion through the water or sound in the water, it travels in a wave, a pressure wave, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so if you have a fly that, say, has a kind of a big head, like a muddler, and pushes water, that's going to push out pressure waves. Mm-hmm. If you also have a fly that, let's say you use, what is it? Icelandic sheep, which is a super flexible material that doesn't bog down in water like marabou or whatnot. That gives a good motion as well. But all that motion is transmitted through the water. Those pressure waves will travel, pretty good distances. And so that can pull in a fish that otherwise, wouldn't see the fly. Mm-hmm. Then the second thing is profile. Mm-hmm. Because when a fish is coming towards a fly, most of the time, say you're fishing on top, the fish will come up at a 45-degree angle to attack. Mm-hmm. If he's coming up or even coming from the side, he's probably not going to see a lot of color. He's going to see profile first.
Yeah.
So another way to think of it is if you had a mirror in the water, horizontal, and you face the reflective side down and go below it, it's going to be hard to see a reflection because the amount of light on a sunny day coming through, clear water is something like 10,000 times greater than the reflected light going back up.
Yeah. Wow.
Right. So if fish are looking up,
mm-hmm.
They're going to see a bright background and a profile of the fly.
Yeah.
And the third thing I think about is color. Mm-hmm. Because it's that color that's going to get them when they're close.
Yeah. That's going to, if needed, color is critical. But it would be, they would see opacity looking up like you were describing, and they'd see profile.
Right. You got to get them to the fly first.
Yeah. Got it.
And then, the color kind of closes the deal.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. Really great. Let's change gears for a second. I'm going to read something real quick, and then we're going to go to some closing questions. This podcast is brought to you by Saltwater Edge. Go to saltwateredge.com to check out the latest in surf, fly, light tackle, and jigging gear. We have hundreds of 5-star reviews for our same-day shipping, advocacy for our fisheries, and our passionate crew of anglers ready to answer your questions about tackle and tactics from bonefish to bluefin. Use code PREY, P-R-E-Y, from your book. Use the code PREY to get free shipping on your next order. So changing gears, Aaron, I have a couple questions I wanted to ask. What would be 2 tips? Well, let's start with resources since you've got such a strong science background, a career. What would be 2 resources you'd suggest to somebody wanting to learn more, maybe about habitat and how to apply this, how to ask those questions why, the flip the script that we started this conversation with, where you're looking at the habitat and what lives there to then, represent. And obviously I would personally plug this book. It was a great example of it because it helped me think through some of it. But you have so many citations in the back and all, where there's some other things besides your guide to saltwater prey that you would maybe suggest as a resource that someone could use?
Sure. That first book, Fisherman's Coast from 2004, I redid that in 2014.
Oh, you did? So you have a copy of this?
No, not another copy. I did another edition. So I took that as the core.
Yeah.
and rewrote it a little bit.
2003.
Yeah, and then in 2014, I took that as a core, rewrote it some, and added a chapter on tides and on sight and sound in the water, and a few other things. And that came out in 2014. That came out in 2014 as the Orvis Fly Fishing Guide for Coastal Gamefish.
Oh, I didn't put that together. Okay, I knew there was a third book. I didn't realize it was incorporated.
Yeah, it built on that one, used that as a core, and kind of built up.
Thanks for clarifying that.
And then I've written some chapters on that same theme of translating science into fishing. Chico Fernandez has a great book on fly fishing for bonefish, another one on redfish, and I wrote chapters there with him. And so that's nice because it combines, my fishing and science experience with, his expertise fishing for both those species.
Yeah, I haven't read the redfish book. I've got the bonefish book out.
Yeah, I mean, and there's other well-written books on bonefish. Dick Brown did a good one on flies. There's another good one prior to that, and then going back, Kaufman, etc., going back a long ways. That were well researched for sure.
Yeah.
So they can all be good resources. If you really want to geek out, you can go online and search for scientific articles. Some of them you'll be able to access. Some of them you have to have a subscription to a scientific journal. Sure. But if you can get the contact information for the lead author, you can request a copy by email.
Okay.
So there's a resource on Google called scholar.google.com. Yeah. And that is specific to the scientific literature.
Okay.
So yeah, that's where all that hardcore research and that kind of stuff is.
That sounds fun.
Yeah, depending on how deep a rabbit hole you want to go into.
That's what we have winter. You said you're cold. We have winter, right?
Yeah, that's true.
I need something to do.
I once had a fisherman up there tell me he liked winter because it gave him a break, and I said that's BS. You just need some kind of rationale why you're so miserable for 6 months, 4 months. Yeah, another resource is other more experienced anglers.
Yeah.
So, you just gave some examples about Tony and some others, and how they approach it. That experience is super helpful.
Yeah.
And then your next step is to say, okay, this is what they saw, and then try and figure out the why. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Why the fish were behaving that way. Was it the wind direction, the water temperature, the moon phase? Any of those kind of things could influence that. So,
sure.
Those are a couple big ones for sure.
That sounds great. Really appreciate it. I didn't know about that google.scholar.com. So if anyone was looking for me, that's probably where it all be. And then maybe 2 tips, that you would have to somebody that's looking to improve as an angler, given your unique perspective.
Sure. So I guess the first one would be to experiment and observe.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of times you get out in the water and you're fishing hard. And sometimes it pays to just put the rod down and watch.
Yeah.
So a friend of mine who was a guide in the lower Florida Keys said the best advice he got when he moved down there and asked an older guide, about that. The guy said, go get yourself a bucket of fried chicken, take your skiff out on a flat, and spend the day out there and just watch.
Chicken. Yeah.
Yeah. Whatever your food choice is.
It sounds great.
But it's essentially, observe a lot. Mm-hmm. And the other side of that is to experiment. Don't always do the same thing. Every time I go fishing, every day, I try and check out a different place or fish a different way at some point during the day. Because you can get into a real rut about going to the same places or fishing the same tides. And so experimenting that way, I think, is super important. Just remember, if you're experimenting backcountry, always do it on a rising tide.
Right. Yes.
Because if you do it on a dropping tide and you get too far up there, you're going to be there for a long time.
Yeah. It's interesting. As a scientist, Aaron, you say experimenting, um, and trying something new. I think we all have habits, and so what you're doing is by experimenting is breaking that and trying something new. And it could be you come around the corner or out on this beach that you never fished on this tide, and it's loaded. It's like and you had all this logic in your head about why it wouldn't be and why you never went there. Is that the gist of what that point is? Yeah.
When 100%.
You're a scientist. That's why I wanted to ask a little.
You're more likely to learn something new if you get outside of your box.
There you go.
And the box is productive, but you can get kind of lackadaisical, too comfortable. Mm-hmm. Another way to think about it, let's say you're up there in New England or wherever in the Caribbean. There's no such thing as a wasted walk along a beach.
Yeah.
Right. You might, if you get on the Caribbean at whatever island and you walk along with a fly rod, and you might not catch a bonefish, but you can probably find some jacks and those types of things. So yeah, that's a big one. And then you should pay attention while you're doing that kind of stuff.
Curious. Your first answer there about observation, I've got a talk that I've only done a little bit of it at this point, but it's really remarkable in these 35 plus podcasts and all the people I've talked to and in doing what I do, great anglers, some of them I haven't, specifically interviewed, but way up there is observation, stealth, and experimentation. And this is the upper echelon. If you want to get there, those are 3 of the rungs for sure.
Yeah. I mean, one more thing that's, along this line of thought is that, especially for saltwater anglers, is stick your face under the water.
Mm-hmm.
How many saltwater anglers have actually gone snorkeling where they fish to see what the fish sees?
Yeah.
Right? Because the bait fish or the crabs, they don't look like you think they look.
Right.
From that perspective.
Right.
Or that's an easier
too. You get down there and and then it moves and you're like, holy cow. Oh shit, there's a dozen, at the sand eels kind of thing, or not sand eels, oversized, right to the bottom.
Yeah, I mean,
all of a sudden you realize there's bunches of them.
Yep. And so doing that can really be eye-opening.
Yeah.
Getting that fish's perspective is to do that. If you take a break or even just take a day and go check things out.
Yeah, I think get a coffee, get a bucket of chicken. That's good. That's really good advice. So, Aaron, if folks want to learn more about what you're doing, I will put all 3 of the books in the show notes. So the first being Fisherman's Coast, the second one being Fly Fisherman's Guide to Saltwater Prey, which goes all the way up here, if you will, into the Northeast, and then the most recent 2014, the Orvis book, Fly Fishing for Coastal Gamefish, was it?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I'll get all those in the show notes. But and I know you have a full-time job at the Bonefish Tarpon Trust. So where can people go to learn more about what you're up to, or maybe more about what the initiatives of Bonefish Tarpon Trust are, or whatever you want to point them to?
Sure. Our website is bonefishtarpontrust.org or btt.org. Okay. We have all the stuff about the research we're doing, the conservation efforts and resource management efforts that we're doing. You can also there access, we put out a magazine twice a year called the Bonefish Tarpon Journal. It's usually about 50 pages or so. And it's full of articles that summarize the research that we do, what we found out about the species, and how we're applying that to management. And so there, you can go back, I think it's probably 10 years now worth of journal issues.
On the website?
On the website, yeah. You can see the journal and you can go back through.
You contribute a lot of articles to that over time, I know, because I get that magazine.
Yeah. So the website is super informative. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Our social media team does a fantastic job sharing the stuff that we do. I mean, we work everywhere from Chesapeake Bay to, Southern Caribbean.
Sure.
So you're just as likely to read an article about tarpon migrations, from Key West to Chesapeake Bay as you are to read about some work going on in Belize.
Sure. This is just a follow-up then. What are the top couple, 2, 3 initiatives of the Bonefish Tarpon Trust at present?
Wow, just 2 or 3.
I know it. Right? That's
I
what
mean, there's so much stuff going on.
Come into your head.
Well, I guess kind of going back to kind of some of the foundation, because it's applicable upward use, applicable everywhere, is we're pushing hard on improving water quality, right? So too many nutrients, too many contaminants coming into the coastal waters. Pharmaceuticals, too many nutrients from wastewater treatment outflows or from septic tank outflows. Stormwater runoff has all kinds of stuff like glyphosate, which is Roundup in it, and a bunch of others, heavy metals. So trying to use our information to force some improvements in water quality. And then we do a lot of research on the habitats the fish depend on.
Yep.
So, for example, we know that juvenile tarpon that are about the size of a dime or a nickel, they need sandy beaches. And then as they grow, they'll move out deeper into grass beds and et cetera. So you don't just focus where the adults are, you also have to focus on the juvenile habitats. For tarpon and snook, they need backwater or wetlands. And unfortunately, those are pretty attractive to developers.
Sure.
So yeah, water and habitat are the biggest. And then I guess the third one is just the connectivity. So that you gave an example, of the albie that was tagged and up north and caught down in Key West. We've tagged tarpon in Key West or west of Key West, and detected them way up in Chesapeake Bay.
Sure.
Key West to the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
Those bonefish I talked about that can migrate 100 miles from their home flat to a spawning location. So in the Bahamas, we're trying to get the spawning locations protected because they're shallow bays near deep water, they're attractive for marinas. And I'm sure you can think of a lot of examples up by you where that water quality habitat issue is problematic.
Yeah, for sure.
And so from a basic, not going into specific projects, but from an overall kind of perspective.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Yeah.
Very helpful. Well, it syncs up. It sure sounds science-based to me.
It is. It's all of our policy initiatives are science-based.
Yeah, excellent.
And I think that's a big thing that makes Bonefish Tarpon Trust so influential, even though we're a relatively small organization.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think, it's absolutely true. Well, I've enjoyed the heck out of this, Aaron.
Yeah, it's been fun.
If you want to come back up here and chase the stripers or the albies, hit me up for sure. Okay. So I would love to be side by side that brain of yours as you're processing that onboard computer. Is that what you call it?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, it's really a helpful framework, to keep asking why and to really maybe start with the habitat and work backwards to the selection. And we could keep going for sure, but I think we've done it a good going over. So I do appreciate your time. And like I said, all these a lot of the topics in the books and stuff we've talked about will be in the show notes, and we'll take it from there. Aaron, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
You take care.
You too.